December 18, 1992. Howard Stern is live on K-Rock, ranting to 5 million listeners when his producer Gary Delabate appears in the doorway. Gary's face is dead white. He's holding a phone. Howard stops mid-sentence. The studio goes silent. Gary mouths 2 words. Your father. In the next 40 minutes, the most fearless man in radio will completely fall apart on live air, and what America hears will change Howard Stern forever. But to understand what happened that morning, you need to know who Ben Stern was. Not just Howard's father, the man who created Howard Stern. Ben was a recording engineer who ran his own studio in Manhattan. Tough, cold, impossible to please. He survived the Depression, fought in World War II, built a business from nothing. He expected perfection, especially from his son. Howard grew up in Roosevelt, Long Island in the 60s, one of the only white kids in a mostly black neighborhood. He got beaten up constantly. He was terrified. And when he came home crying, Ben had zero sympathy. You're weak, his father would say. Toughen up. The world doesn't care that you're scared. That voice, that disappointment in his father's eyes, became the engine behind everything Howard did. Every shocking bit, every boundary pushed, every time he made America gasp, it was Howard screaming at his father, I'm not weak, I matter, I'm somebody. But here's what nobody knew. Despite building the biggest show in America, despite the millions of dollars, despite the fame, Howard still desperately wanted his father's approval. And Ben Stern thought Howard's show was garbage. Crude, tasteless, embarrassing. He'd call Howard after listening and tell him how disappointed he was. And Howard, the guy who destroyed celebrities and politicians without flinching, would take it. Every single time. In December 1992, Howard's show was exploding. He was number 1 in every major market. His book Private Parts was being written. Hollywood was calling. He was untouchable. But Ben Stern, 73 years old, was declining. His health had been getting worse for months. Emphysema from decades of smoking. His lungs were failing. Howard knew his father was sick, but Ben refused to acknowledge weakness. He kept working, kept pushing, kept pretending everything was fine. That's what Ben Stern did. You didn't complain. You didn't show vulnerability. You handled your problems alone. Howard had learned that lesson well, maybe too well. On December 17th, the day before everything changed, Howard called his parents' house in Florida. His mother Ray answered. How's Dad? Howard asked. She said Ben was resting, he'd had a rough few days but he was okay. Howard said he'd call back tomorrow. That was it. No I love you. No real conversation. Just a quick check-in because that's how the Stern men operated. They didn't do emotional. They didn't do vulnerable. They did functional. The next morning, December 18th, Howard arrived at K-Rock around 5:30 a.m. like always. He walked into the studio where Robin Quivers, his co-host, Fred Norris, his producer, and Jackie Martling, his head writer, were already setting up. They went through the usual pre-show routine. Howard reviewed bits, complained about management, drank his coffee. At 6 a.m., they went live. The first hour was typical Stern. Raunchy jokes, celebrity gossip, bits about strippers. The audience was eating it up. Howard was in his element, totally in control, making millions of people laugh during their morning commute. He had no idea his world was about to detonate. Around 7:15 a.m., Gary Delabate, Howard's longtime producer known as Baba Booey, was in his office adjacent to the studio monitoring the show. The phone rang. It was Howard's mother Ray. Gary knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong because Ray Stern never called the show. Ever. Gary, she said, her voice shaking. I need to talk to Howard. It's Ben. Gary felt his stomach drop. Is he okay? Gary asked. Ray started crying. He's gone, Gary. Ben died an hour ago. Gary stood there holding the phone, paralyzed. He could hear Howard through the wall, laughing, doing a bit about some ridiculous news story. 5 million people were listening. How do you tell someone their father just died while they live on the air? Gary walked to the studio door. He stood there for what felt like forever, watching Howard through the glass. Howard was animated, gesturing wildly, making Robin laugh. Gary opened the door. Howard glanced over, saw Gary's face, and stopped talking mid-sentence. The laughter died. Gary was holding the phone, and Howard saw tears in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Howard said. His voice was different now. Flat. The audience couldn't see Gary, but they could hear the shift in Howard's tone. Gary walked closer. He put his hand on Howard's shoulder. "Howard, your mom's on the phone. It's about your dad." Howard stared at Gary. Then he looked at Robin. She had gone completely still. Fred stopped what he was doing. Jackie was frozen. Howard reached for the phone with a shaking hand. "Mom," Howard said. And then he listened. The studio was dead silent. Millions of people were listening to nothing, just waiting. Howard's face changed. The color drained. His eyes went empty. He nodded slowly even though his mother couldn't see him. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, Mom. I understand. I'll be there. I love you." He hung up the phone and set it down carefully on the console. Then he just sat there, staring at nothing. Robin spoke first. "Howard, what happened?" Howard didn't look at her. He was still staring straight ahead. "My father died this morning," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "He had a heart attack. He's dead." The words hung in the air. Robin's hand went to her mouth. Fred looked down. Jackie sat motionless. And 5 million people listening to their radios heard Howard Stern, the man who feared nothing, completely break. "I need to go," Howard said, but he didn't move. He just sat there in his chair, frozen. Gary put his hand on Howard's shoulder again. "Howard, we can cut to commercial. We can end the show." Howard shook his head. "No," he said. "No, I need to," and then he stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. Robin leaned forward. "Howard, go be with your family. We'll handle this." But Howard didn't leave. He sat there in that studio for 37 more minutes, and what happened next was the most raw, unfiltered, devastating radio anyone had ever heard. Howard started talking, but it wasn't the Howard Stern America knew. There were no jokes. No bits. No performance. This was just a man falling apart in real time. "I never told him," Howard said suddenly. His voice was shaking. "I never told my father that I loved him. Not really. Not in a way that mattered." Robin tried to comfort him. "Howard, I'm sure he knew." Howard's head snapped up. "Did he, Robin? Did he know? Because I spent my whole life trying to make him proud and he never once said he was. Not once." The bitterness in Howard's voice was cutting. Fred and Jackie exchanged looks but said nothing. This wasn't the time for jokes or bits. This was real grief, live and unfiltered. "Every time I did something," Howard continued, "every time I accomplished something, I'd wait for him to say he was proud. And you know what he'd say? He'd point out what I did wrong. 'The show's too dirty, Howard. You're embarrassing yourself. Why can't you do something respectable?' His voice broke on the last word. Gary, still standing nearby, was openly crying now. The rest of the crew were in shock. Nobody had ever heard Howard like this. "I became the biggest name in radio," Howard said, "and my father thought I was a disgrace. Do you understand what that does to someone? To spend your entire life screaming for attention from one person and never getting it?" Robin spoke carefully. "Howard, maybe this isn't the time. Maybe you should take some time before you talk about this." "No," Howard shot back. "When is the time, Robin? When? He's dead. He's gone and I never got to hear him say he was proud of me. I never got that. And now I never will." The studio was silent except for Howard's ragged breathing. Millions of people were listening to the most famous shock jock in America completely unravel. This wasn't entertainment. This was someone's life imploding in real time. "I remember being a kid," Howard said, his voice distant now, "and I try so hard to impress him. I'd bring home good grades, I'd show him things I made, I'd try to be what he wanted. And he'd just look at me like I was a disappointment. Like I wasn't enough. Robin had tears streaming down her face now. Howard, you were enough. You are enough. Howard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Then why did I spend 40 years trying to prove it? Why did every single thing I did, every risk I took, every boundary I pushed, why was it all about showing him I mattered? He put his head in his hands. The show was still live. The commercials hadn't run. America was hearing all of it. Gary quietly suggested again that they cut to break. Howard waved him off. You know what the worst part is, Howard said, lifting his head. The worst part is that I became exactly like him. Cold, distant, impossible to please. I treated people the way he treated me. I pushed people away. I made my own kids feel like they had to earn my approval. I became the thing I hated most. This confession was stunning. Howard Stern, admitting his deepest failures live on air. Fred finally spoke. Howard, you're a good father. You're nothing like Ben. Yes, I am, Fred, Howard snapped. I am exactly like him. And that terrifies me. Because now he's gone and I can't fix it. I can't go back and have the conversations we should have had. I can't tell him that despite everything, despite all the criticism and the disappointment, I still wanted him to love me. I still needed him to love me. His voice cracked completely on those last words. The room was suffocating with grief. Jackie, who usually had something to say, sat in absolute silence. This was beyond anything any of them had experienced. This was Howard Stern, the invincible, finally showing the world what was underneath all the bravado and shock and performance. Just a son who desperately wanted his father's love. Howard wiped his eyes and looked directly at the microphone. If you're listening right now, and you have a father, or a mother, or someone you love who you haven't told lately, call them. Don't wait. Don't assume they know. Tell them. Because I'm sitting here with all the money and all the fame in the world, and none of it matters. None of it matters because I never got to hear my father say he was proud of me. And that hole, that emptiness, I'll carry it for the rest of my life. Robin was crying openly now. Howard, we love you. We're here for you. I know, Howard said quietly. I know you are, Robin. But it doesn't fill the hole. Nothing fills the hole. He stood up slowly, like his body weighed 1,000 pounds. I need to go, he said. I need to go see my mother. Gary moved to help him, but Howard waved him off. I'm okay. And then he stopped. No, I'm not okay. I'm not okay at all. But I need to go. He took off his headphones and set them on the console. Then he looked around the studio at the people who had become his family. Robin, Fred, Jackie, Gary. Take care of the show, he said. I don't know when I'll be back. Robin stood up. Take all the time you need, Howard. We'll be here. Howard nodded. Then he walked out of the studio, leaving his crew to fill the dead air, leaving millions of listeners in stunned silence, leaving behind the wreckage of the most emotionally devastating broadcast in radio history. But what happened in the hours and days after Howard left that studio would reveal an even darker truth about Howard's relationship with his father, and the guilt that would consume him for years to come. Howard drove from the K-Rock studios in Manhattan straight to LaGuardia Airport. He was still in his radio clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, no luggage, nothing. He bought a ticket for the next flight to West Palm Beach where his parents lived. During the flight, Howard sat in his seat staring out the window, not speaking, not moving. Fellow passengers recognized him but nobody approached. Something about his face, the emptiness in his eyes, kept everyone away. When he landed in Florida, Howard rented a car and drove to his parents' house. His mother Ray was there with Howard's sister Ellen. When Howard walked in, Ray collapsed into his arms. They both cried, but Howard's tears were different. They weren't just grief. They were rage and regret and decades of unspoken pain all pouring out at once. The funeral was held 3 days later at a small chapel in Florida. Howard gave the eulogy, and what he said shocked everyone who attended. He didn't talk about Ben's accomplishments or his business success. He talked about the distance between them. He talked about the disappointment. He talked about the approval he never got. Some family members were uncomfortable. This wasn't how you spoke at funerals. But Howard didn't care anymore. His father was dead, the performance was over, the truth was all that mattered now. After the funeral, Howard returned to New York, but he didn't go back on air immediately. For the first time in his career, Howard Stern took time off. Not a vacation. A breakdown. He stayed in his apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, replaying every conversation with his father, every criticism, every moment he'd failed to say what he really felt. His wife Allison tried to reach him, but Howard had shut down completely. He was drowning in guilt, and there was no lifeline. When Howard finally returned to the show 2 weeks later, he was different. The edge was still there, the humor, the shock value, but something fundamental had shifted. Howard started talking about his father regularly on air. Not in a sentimental way, in a brutally honest way. He'd tell stories about Ben's cruelty, his coldness, his impossible standards. And he'd talk about how desperately he still wanted his father's approval even though Ben was gone. It was uncomfortable radio. Listeners didn't know how to react. This wasn't fun anymore. This was therapy happening live on air. But Howard didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Because talking about it was the only way he knew how to process the grief and the guilt that was eating him alive. Years later, in 2002, Howard released his second book, Miss America. In it, he wrote extensively about his father's death and the regret he carried. He wrote, "My father died thinking I was a failure. He died believing that everything I'd accomplished meant nothing because I'd done it the wrong way. And the worst part is, I let him believe that. I never fought back. I never stood up and said, I don't need your approval anymore. I just kept trying to earn it, like a dog begging for scraps." That passage revealed something crucial. Howard's entire career, the shock jock persona, the boundary pushing, the need to be the biggest, the loudest, the most outrageous, it was all a son screaming for his father's attention. And when Ben died, the person Howard was screaming at was gone. The performance lost its meaning. In 2006, Howard moved his show to Sirius Satellite Radio in a groundbreaking deal worth $500 million. During his first week on Sirius, Howard did an extended segment about his father. He played old audio clips of Ben calling into the show to criticize him. He played the recording from December 18, 1992, when he found out Ben had died. Listeners heard Howard's voice break all over again. And then Howard said something stunning. "I forgive him. I forgive my father for never being able to show me love the way I needed. And I forgive myself for never being brave enough to tell him I loved him anyway." That moment, nearly 14 years after Ben's death, was when Howard finally started to heal. Not completely. The wound was too deep for that. But enough to breathe again. Enough to stop performing for a ghost. In more recent years, Howard has spoken often about how his father's death changed him as a parent. He talks about being present for his 3 daughters in ways Ben never was for him. He talks about telling them he loves them, constantly, obsessively, because he knows what it's like to never hear those words. He talks about breaking the cycle of emotional distance that destroyed his relationship with his father. And he talks about the guilt. Always the guilt. In a 2019 interview, Howard said, "I think about my father every single day. I think about the conversations we didn't have, the relationship we could have had if either of us had been brave enough to be vulnerable. And I live with the knowledge that I had the power to change it, and I didn't. That's on me. That guilt, that regret, it never goes away." That's the real story of what happened when Howard Stern's father died. Not just the on-air breakdown, not just the funeral, but the decades of pain and regret that followed. The realization that all the fame and success in the world means nothing if you can't connect with the people who matter most. Howard Stern built an empire by being fearless, by saying what others wouldn't, by pushing boundaries nobody else would touch. But when it came to his father, he was terrified. terrified of being vulnerable, terrified of being rejected, terrified of showing the real Howard underneath all the performance. And that fear cost him the one thing he wanted most: his father's love. Or at least the chance to know if that love existed. There's audio from that December morning in 1992 that occasionally resurfaces online. It's not the full 37 minutes, just clips. But you can hear it. You can hear the exact moment Howard Stern's voice changes. You can hear the shock, the disbelief, the grief. You can hear a man who built his entire identity on being unbreakable completely shatter. And if you listen closely, underneath all the pain and the regret, you can hear something else. You can hear a son still calling out for his father, still hoping that somehow, somewhere, Ben Stern finally heard him. That's the cruelest part of the story. Not that Ben Stern died. Death comes for everyone. The cruelest part is that Howard never got his answer. He never knew if his father was proud. He never knew if all the screaming and performing and boundary pushing finally made Ben see him as worthy. He never got closure. He never got peace. He only got the guilt of knowing he could have tried harder to bridge the gap, and the devastating reality that now it was too late. Howard Stern once said in an interview years after his father's death, "If I could trade everything, the career, the money, the fame, all of it, for one conversation with my father where he tells me he loved me and he was proud, I'd do it in a heartbeat. But I can't. And that's something I'll carry until the day I die." That's the real cost of emotional distance. That's what happens when fathers and sons speak in disappointment and criticism instead of love. You run out of time. And when you run out of time, all you're left with is regret. Howard Stern found out his father was dead on December 18, 1992. But the truth is, he's been mourning that relationship his entire life. And that, more than anything else, is what broke the king of all media.